So welcome to the fourth in the series of CPS 230 readiness webinars. And I have not been involved in the first three. It's been ably run by my colleague Michael, who will be joining us. We'll be doing the fourth one, which is all about scenarios and scenario analysis. So as always, I am with me. I've got my partner in crime, or partner in webinar, I should say, Michael. So Michael, I'll just get you to introduce yourself and then I'll do the same and then we'll move on to the webinar.
Thanks, David. Happy to be presenting today on this really important topic as part of CPS 230. So I am the Senior Manager of Research and Content at Protect. The title probably says a fair bit about that, and David will go more into about what the team does overall. But I do look after our on-demand training, Protect Academy, also feed a lot of our research that we do into our product, as well as the content like this webinar, blogs, ebooks. We've got a CPS 230 white paper. And also led Protect's internal consultation during the draft process or consultation process for APRA CPS 230 when it first came out. Over to you, David.
Fantastic, Michael. Yeah, my name's David. I look after the research and content in Protect, and the focus of that, as it implies, is doing a lot of work in researching where risk management is going together with Michael, and also producing a lot of content, including webinars out of that, and also importantly our academy training, which we'll just briefly mention at the end. Also, when I'm doing this webinar and putting this webinar together, it reminded me of many years ago when the focus of our regulator APRA turned to stress testing and so on. And when we were doing this, it certainly jogged a lot of memories and a lot of similarities, which we will touch upon, but a lot of differences as well. So in terms of the webinar, as we always do, it will run for around about 60 minutes, and that will cover a good section of it being the presentation, 45 to 50 minutes. Now, when we are running through the webinar, if you can please post your questions into the question box, and we will look to answer those by way of a written response, which we'll share with everyone. So please do that as we go. Also, there will be a post-webinar questionnaire. Great feedback for us, as always. So please take a couple of minutes at the end just to complete that. And as we are always asked, and the answer is always yes, the slides and the recording will be made available to you, and we will send that link to you once the webinar has been completed. So in terms of context, Michael.
Yeah, as we've done throughout the rest of this series, I'd like to frame up this timeline that APRA have released alongside the CPG 230 guidance, where people should be fairly well along. We're only a few months away now from CPS 230 coming live, so should have already identified your critical operations, material service providers, and put those tolerance levels in place based on this expected timeline. Now, there are some of these clauses that have been, I guess there's an extension for some of the business continuity clauses, particularly related to for non-CPs, where the requirements to meet some of the business continuity clauses for testing still rely on the old CPS 232, particularly around not when you're testing your business continuity program against tolerance levels under the new requirements, they're still against what are the objectives of your business continuity management program under the old requirements. But today we're going to be really covering making sure we're meeting those tolerance levels. So this has been our road to readiness. As I mentioned, we assume that many of you are going to be fairly well along this pathway for some of these earlier webinars. But if you do want to go back to the previous webinars, either to review, if this is the first time you're joining us, we covered the capturing critical operations and their tolerance levels. We captured material service providers and controls management being some of these key components or drivers of CPS 230. And today we're closing out this series with the resilience through scenarios. We think that's going to be a bit of a shift with the way people are thinking. Now, this won't be the last word that we have on CPS 230, but it might be the last thing before it comes live. But I'm sure you'll hear more from us on CPS 230 beyond readiness.
So turning to today's webinar, we're going to look at the following. Number one, why, which is really the need for scenarios. What is the objectives? What's the purpose? There's the obvious one, which is meet regulatory requirements, but that is not an outcome, a business value focused view. So we're going to address what does it really do. Secondly, what are scenarios? There's a lot of discussion around the types of scenario, all those kind of things. We're going to get into a bit of depth exactly what scenarios are, and very importantly, developing and then when running scenarios against your critical operations. Also, very importantly, who should do what in your scenario analysis process, and also when should your scenarios be run. And we're going to finish off with the output, which is going to be the reporting for scenarios, and that is obviously going to be critically important for reporting up to board executive management and also APRA where required. So first of all, looking at the need for scenarios. Right, so Michael, in terms of CPS 230, obviously there's a lot of mention of this. What are the key, key clauses in there that deal with scenario analysis?
So it is embedded throughout CPS 230. Obviously, there's the distinction or the different components related to business continuity, but a number of the clauses outside of the business continuity component still include this testing of scenarios or using scenarios to test these tolerance levels. So 16E, we've got 27C, which talks about scenario analysis, which is about the overall risk profile. So it needs to be embedded as part of the risk profile, not just the severe but plausible, which we'll get to a little bit later in today's session. But when we think more deeply or look more deeply at what the requirements are in the BCP section, then we've got testing, making sure that your plans are tested. You've got to cover all of your critical operations and the different tolerance levels across them. And it needs to cover that range of severe but plausible scenarios. So they are embedded throughout different components of the CPS 230 standard and supported through the guidance. So this is the high level requirements, David. So do you want to talk us through, I guess, what scenario analysis is, at a high level?
Yes, certainly. So scenario analysis, put very simply, is a process of looking forward and considering a range of potential future events and the alternative outcomes that could happen from those. Now, as a result of that, it is used extensively both on the objectives planning side, strategy planning side, where we typically run probably commonly three scenarios, which is kind of expected case, worst case, and best case. And that is what we typically find in to do with kind of strategic planning or business planning. We could then apply the same approach, but this time to risk, which is what today is really all about, where we come up with various scenarios around the level of risk. Now, what happens there for a particular risk? We don't tend to do kind of the expected, the worst case, the best case. Well, we might a little bit, we'll cover that later, but with scenario analysis in its risk form, we kind of go to a pretty bad case. I don't want to steal the thunder from the words we actually use, but it's really kind of an extreme case. So as a result, it's not much point doing other than one specific scenario in its extremities based on that particular risk. So what that really does, it gives us a way of looking into the future. And as you can appreciate, this is quite an art form because very commonly, question for all of you rhetorically is how often has a forecast ever come true exactly? You generally get variations around it, but the same would be true of risk scenarios. And I guess historically, we've often talked about scenario analysis from a risk perspective as being stress testing. And I've always used this definition out of Wikipedia that I thought was very telling, particularly sometimes called torture testing. So we are torturing the business or torturing the critical operations to see what happens, and particularly intensely torturing it out of a range that it would normally be used to operating in. So testing outside its operational capacity, often to a breaking point. At what point will it break? We'll talk about that kind of stress in order to observe the results, focused on determining breaking points or safe usage limits, and that in a way hints at tolerance levels. Confirm the intended specifications or our understanding of the critical operation. Is it operating or is it robust as we think it is? Thirdly, to determine the modes of failure. So what is actually causing the system to fail? And this links strongly with our risks. And lastly, to test the stable operation outside normal usage. And that's really the key to make sure we are resilient. Now, we should also highlight that stress testing or scenario analysis, whichever way you call it, is not new from APRA. Those of you that have been around the traps as long as I have will remember a lot of work done with APRA around capital adequacy requirements. And this is from a 2012 speech by John Laker. Stress testing talks about what if. looking at vulnerabilities and resilience in the face of, yes, we're going to talk about this, more severe but plausible shocks. And that is severe enough to be meaningful, yet plausible enough to be taken seriously. And I've used that many, many times, and I'll use it again to describe how severe should these scenarios be. Now, that brings us really, I guess, to the objectives of scenario analysis. What are we trying to achieve? Now, there are many objectives. We'll just go through a few here, the main ones, to test whether critical processes meet the tolerance levels under stress scenarios. That's really the key to this from a CPS 230 perspective. To see how resilient and robust our critical operations are. Right? How tough are they? To help inform how strong our resilience controls are. Particularly if you've got redundancy types controls, insurance type controls, are they strong enough or are they big enough to cover and get you recovered? To identify and understand what risks, if they occur, would severely impact our critical operations. And this links back now to what is the source or what is the cause of our critical operations failing, and linking that to our overall taxonomy of risks. To test the overall capacity to withstand stress. And that is often, we'll see later, reverse stress testing is how bad does it need to be before our critical operations do fail and do not meet our tolerance levels. To raise awareness across the organisation of what our big hit risks are. So we use it as a knowledge source. To specifically feed into our other elements of managing the institution. Michael's already mentioned it to a degree, BCP planning, liquidity management, internal capital adequacy assessment process, that is the financial capital, and also for contingency planning. And finally, to satisfy the regulator. And I'm going to say this flippantly, I put it 8 deliberately because it's the least important. And some of you will go, no, it's the most important. As we know with APRA and especially CPS 230, they do not expect to see a tick the box exercise. So it's not about satisfying a regulator, it's to do all of the above, and then by default, you will have satisfied the regulator. So, Michael, that's the key, I guess, scenarios. How do we bring this to life?
Well, I think we can ask the audience, where were you when this happened? And I know where I was, and I'm sure that it's probably kicked up, at the time that it happened, probably kicked up a number of our, the audience, the CPS 230 implementation teams or project teams, probably forced a bit of discussion, I imagine. But David, I'd like to ask where you were, and this image obviously has a bit of meaning to you on the right-hand side.
It does indeed. So I was with one of our clients in Adelaide, and I was training their IT department, and I had 24 people in the room, and I was talking about incident management. The timing was just impeccable. And while I was doing that, a member of the team that wasn't on the training course came in and said, "We have a major incident." And the group looked at me and said, "Very good, Dave, great simulation." And I said, "This isn't a simulation." So cut a long story short, I ended up with 4 people in the room, not 24. And next minute they came back and said, "The worldwide internet has gone down. The World Wide Web has gone down." And then they came back a bit later saying it wasn't quite as bad. This picture is taken as I tried to get out of Adelaide to get back to Sydney, where I live. And this is the scene when I walked into the airport, and I thought I was going to be there a very long time. But I have to be clear that I was with Virgin, not with Jetstar. And as a result, I got through the airport quicker as I've ever done in my life. And it does highlight the relative vulnerabilities of different organizations, critical operations. But I thought I'd share that with you. That is from my iPhone camera. And I thought when we were doing this, it was worth answering that question, where were you? I definitely know where I was.
So David, out of that event, so I found this report where from PagerDuty, they surveyed over 1,000 IT business executives. And after this particular event, 86% of them went, "Hang on a minute, we've been focusing too much on security," which is obviously a very important thing that you do need to focus on. But they said, "We've been focusing too much on security at the expense of overall resilience, of the overall organization and the systems." And I believe it was, going off the top of my head, I think it was 88% of those also said they expect another event of similar nature within the next 12 months. So I think this is back in July, so we must be due for one, very soon if you want to go by that statistic. So I think it was a bit of a wake-up call. for organizations, that it's not just cybersecurity that's important, but it is overall resilience of your operations.
Mm.
So this was a quote from John Lonsdale, which was for the CrowdStrike event, which sort of reinforces that it is about the resilience of your organization, of the APRA regulated entity, even if you are not the source of the disruption. So banks, this is obviously, I think this speech was to in a banking forum, but it covers all of the APRA regulated entities. It doesn't matter if the source is external to you, you still need to make sure that your organization is resilient, and that you can meet the tolerance levels that you've put in place. So as we love doing, it's my favorite part of the standard, I believe it might be yours as well, David, is just to walk through these relationships, because it matters for scenarios. What is it that you need to use scenarios for? And we start, 27B starts with critical operations, and we then link those through to the tolerance levels that you set. But those critical operations are then supported by the underlying processes. Those processes rely on your resources, which are your people, your information technology, or the systems that you use. Now, those systems, assets might be owned internally, or they might be provided by your service providers. Now, we layer on top of that our risks or our scenarios, and those scenarios can affect some of those resources and ultimately then flow through to interrupting your critical operations. So this is the link with scenarios. Now, to complete this picture, we also lay in our obligations, which are required under 27B, as well as our controls to manage risks, scenarios, manage our service providers, and to meet our obligations. So that sets that scene for that critical operations level, but I now want to take this to the organizational level. And we've used this in, I think, all of the road to readiness that we've talked about, because it is so important around critical operations. That you may have this vertical view of business units across the organization, but these critical operations, as defined by APRA, really sit across the organization to the services, to your external stakeholders. And you may have business continuity plans that think about that at the business unit level, or even if you do have an enterprise-wide business continuity plan, it might be based on business unit level business impact analysis or similar processes. So the purpose of scenarios is not just to test those business continuity plans, but to test your critical operations and make sure that you are meeting your tolerance levels against each of those different scenarios. So then on to what scenarios are, now that we've given sort of a backdrop. So scenarios isn't defined specifically by CPS 230. So David went through a little bit around scenario analysis, stress testing, but there isn't a specific way that you must do scenarios. Now, obviously there is this focus on severe but plausible, which isn't fully defined or fleshed out. CPS 230 is a very principles-based standard. So there are lots of different types of scenarios. I'm probably expecting that most will run more narrative-based approaches, probably at least to begin with. Very interested to hear from our audience if they're using any sort of quantitative approaches or adapting some of these approaches. But we typically think about the narrative-based as breaking down into resource-based. So thinking about what is a resource that I need, and if that resource is missing, then what happens? What happens to my critical operation if it's missing? Now, that doesn't take into account the broader context, which is the event-based, which is what are the types of events that could happen, which would then flow into the effect on some of the response effort as well. Now, some of these other elements that we've talked about, stress testing, reverse stress testing, those tend to be more on a balance sheet level or cash flow or market risk or various other financial risks more than non-financial typically. Not sure if you've got any more that you want to add to that, David, on some of those, but I think maybe you could adapt this to business processes that might have quantitative models that sit behind them. So perhaps you're forecasting over your call center as an example, and stress some of the variables that you have in some of those models. So adapting it from a balance sheet perspective to a individual critical operation perspective. Any more thoughts from you, David, on some of the types of scenarios that we might want to adapt?
The only one was, I guess, reverse stress testing. It sounds easy, but having done it a bit, it's not that easy. And this is where we take I guess the something like a resource and go, what are the risks to that resource? And then we go, how big does that risk need to be so that our tolerance levels are breached? So it's kind of working backwards, and it's a kind of it's an interesting way to go, what's the strength of, for example, controls over the risks of our resources, if that makes sense? What should we be spending on our controls in order to meet our tolerance levels? It sounds reasonable, but having done it, it's really hard, because you then get, you could do it one at a time, if you like, one resource at a time or one control at a time, but where you now say, well, if I had this control getting this week, and this one this week, and this one this week, then it would all go. But if it was this one and number 4, then it wouldn't, and it gets really hard. So any of you got words of wisdom, please share with us. And then sensitivity analysis is similar, but this is really about if the level of a risk of a resource were to change by X%, if there was such an ability to do it, how much would it impact the tolerance? And it really is kind of a ratio sensitivity. If it changes by X, then Y happens. Again, as Michael said, we've typically used it in balance sheet, financial, capital adequacy, but the use of it in this is really difficult. My view, honestly, Michael, is probably number 2 is stress testing based on your resource and event based would be really the way to go. So with that said, you have focused here on the word severe but plausible, and you know, this has been used by APRA for a long time, and I've often thought, what does severe but plausible really mean? And the standards do say severe enough to be taken seriously, which means it needs to be a scenario that could lead to you not meeting your tolerance levels. If it's a scenario that regardless wouldn't affect your tolerance levels, then we're not looking at it. There's no point, it's not material. The second one is plausible enough to be taken seriously. And for many, many years, when I've been doing workshops on stress testing, I've used a wonderfully technical technique called the giggle test. And the giggle test is where you take the workshop and you start talking about scenarios and you push it really far. Let's say that we have an attack by Martians in spaceships with whatever, and you get the giggles going on in the room. You've lost people, totally lost them. And you keep reversing back, and we might talk about this later, or Michael might, you know, a meteor shower or something like that, and people go, starting to grin a bit, but you know what, I know that that's happened. We've got dents all over this earth of ours, so maybe it's plausible enough, and that's what we've often used. That's very subjective. So if we now move it to an objective end, then we're starting to talk about the range of consequences against or for a specific risk. For those of you that like your statistics, is risk probability distribution. Along the bottom is our impacts or expected negative impacts from the risk, our loss, and up the vertical axis is the likelihood or the frequency. As we can see here, we've got a low likelihood of a very low loss, a low likelihood of a very high loss, but a high likelihood of a relatively small loss in the middle. What does this give us? Well, this part here is expected losses. We expect pretty much for that to happen. And if we think about a critical operation, we'd expect hiccups in that operation, but as long as that expected is not outside tolerance levels, we're going to be pretty comfortable, or should I say well within tolerance levels. We should be relatively okay. We're going to get glitches that happen. Then we go over the mean of the distribution, and this moves us now into the realm of big stresses. Severe but plausible is somewhere about there. Why did I put it there? Well, I knew it was roughly there, but we don't know exactly where it is because the standard doesn't say, but it is a long way out there. Now that is obviously supposed to be severe enough to be material, which it is, a large loss, and plausible enough to be taken seriously. To the right of that is extreme and implausible. This is when your people are rolling around on the ground in laughter, hilarity of the scenario that you've created. Now, if those of you that do like numbers, in APRA's capital adequacy ICAP requirements, most of the major banks need to get to like a 99.9% level of confidence, which for the statisticians means that the area under the curve to the left-hand side of severe but plausible would be 99.9% of the whole curve, and there'd be 0.1% on the right side. For a non-advanced bank or non-SIFI institution. We typically move down to like a 90, 99.5 type level of confidence. Now, all of this, when we apply it to operational risk and critical operations, unless you have got everything managed by quant and you've got huge amounts of data, which is very unlikely, we're going to be more to a qualitative approach. So I'd honestly suggest you push people to the severe but plausible end. Now, we do hear around the traps in stress testing and scenario analysis. Oh, we're looking to test ourselves against the black swans. So let's just clear that up. If you hear the word black swan, it comes from Taleb's book from a long time back, and a lot of people use this word black swan incorrectly. Now, the black swan is really a unknown risk, using Donald Rumsfeld's famous quote from years ago. And if it's unknown, means we can't be doing a scenario on it, because otherwise it would be a known risk, because we would be able to create a scenario. So we're not talking about black swans. They are in the far right hand side, the 0.1% line, or even further out than that. Now, as a result, what we're really looking for is what we often refer to as the grey rhino. Michael, let's go have a look at a safari of the grey rhino.
So I think there's two here, David. So there are the grey rhinos. So these are the ones that, I mean, these are very plausible. So they're the things that people might typically ignore. So they may form part of your scenarios, as well as those that are maybe not so obvious or on the horizon, but that are still plausible and might happen. You know, CrowdStrike, for example, I mean, who knows, maybe you could say that was a grey rhino and eventually it's going to happen somewhere, right? But that particular one was obviously very difficult to predict specifically. And that is, I guess, a common component. You can't predict these specifically. So looking at more of a narrative-based approach and the event-based approach that we mentioned before, these are just some examples of scenarios. These might kickstart some of your imagination. You know, pandemic, obviously we've been through a recent pandemic, so that can help inform some of your future scenarios about what would happen next. I'm going to make a guess that it's probably not going to be anything like last time. It'll probably be a little bit more focused. Third-party concentration risk, this is definitely important in financial services. Not just is your third party that you rely on going to fail, but what happens if there is a third party, you know, a crop that serves the entirety of the financial services market? What happens if they fail? So these are just some examples of event-based scenarios that you could consider. I know that, David, I have seen you talk about some of these in previous trainings and webinars, and the giggle test sometimes comes up around space threats. And in December, there was I forget the name of it, but a meteor that was detected.
And, this happens a lot, and sorry, Michael, you cut out, so I did come over the top of you. I think you had a microphone problem, so I will pick it up because I know there's two of us talking, but your microphone did cut and your screen went. Maybe you got hit by an asteroid. I'm not sure, but anyway, with the asteroid one, I guess people start giggling a little bit, but we know it's plausible. The Earth is scattered with the marks of asteroids. And as Michael was saying there, but I don't think we were hearing, more recently, YR4, NASA was talking about a 2.3% chance that it will hit Earth in December 2032. And I think that that has reduced in percentage. I'm not sure, and I'm sure it will go up and down like a yo-yo between now and 2032. And when we realize it's zero, we'll forget all about it, but it's feasible. And we know that that has happened. So, you know, should we be incorporating events like that? I'll leave that in your court, but that is quite a little bit out there. So Michael, I'll cut back to you because you've cut back in again. So I'll pass over to you in looking at the relationships.
So I wanted to just cover this relationship between scenarios and tolerance levels that we've hinted at already. We've covered that critical operations are made up of a range of processes, made up of the resources needed to deliver those processes, and these can be many-to-many relationships. The typical approach to testing business continuity is validating recovery time objectives or recovery point objectives or the maximum level outage at a process level. But what that doesn't necessarily always do, depending on obviously your approach to date, is take that scenario view. So those scenarios will interrupt those resources and processes, but the scenario itself might also disrupt your ability to execute your business continuity plan. And that is one of the requirements of CPS 230, is to make sure that you can maintain that BCP, even through some of those disruptive elements. They need to be able to work during any type of disruption when those disruptions do occur. So with that, let's move into how you can develop out your scenarios. And I want to start or break it down into two sort of key components. So one is the scenario program, because it's not just one scenario that you need to deliver, it's perhaps a library of scenarios. So first of all, we need to develop that library, map any affected resources or the critical operations, and then ensure that complete coverage, because you might have one of the other, some of your critical operations and other scenarios that cover a different set, or maybe different types of tolerance levels. There are 3 tolerance levels for each of your critical operations that you'll need to meet. Next slide, thanks, David. So in terms of then developing out that scenario library, these are some potential inclusions in a scenario, and I certainly won't read all of these, but one thing I think is to get engagement as part of your exercising part of the process, which we'll cover in a minute, is to have a short, sharp name for the scenario. And I think here you can be a bit playful. DDoS devastation, is an example of, I've used the example of the Friday fiber cut fiasco for an undersea cable being cut. So try and just have a bit of fun. This is where you use a large language model like ChatGPT to spin things up, have a little bit of fun with some of those names. Using narratives, document plausibility. So like David said, you might have the giggle test, but explain why you think it's plausible as part of developing out that scenario. What are some of the assumptions that have to be true in order for that scenario to happen or work? I think it's also important to explain how the resources are impacted. So not just modeling out which are the resources that are impacted, but perhaps documenting how are they impacted. As an example, if you've got a flood in a basement, your response is going to be different than if there's a fire. You might not even be able to access the basement if there's a flood, whereas you might be able to do something if there's a fire, as an example. So how the scenario unfolds can also be an important part of testing that scenario. Now, David, I know that both you and I love visually mapping scenarios, risks, and do you want to talk about how we think about this from a using or leveraging bow ties for scenarios?
Absolutely. I have to creep in bow tie analysis into every single webinar. That's a challenge. No, it's not, because it's very useful universally. And you can use risk bow tie analysis to document, develop scenarios. And what we've got going on here, you might need a little bit of a magnifying glass to see it, but it's a typical bow tie. This is within our project EOM system that we use. And in the center, you've got the main scenario event. And as Michael said, if you employ a tabloid journalist, I'm sure you can come up with a wonderful name for that in the center, and that becomes the name of your scenario, the main event. Now, off to the left, it then's got the drivers of that event happening all the way back to the root cause, and on the right, if you follow it through down to the impacts on the business, and that would be your tolerance types and tolerance levels. Now, what we've done here is then develop the scenario by first of all, on the left, the far left, the beginning of the scenario, you need to come up with assumptions. So what are the assumptions for that particular aspect of the risk, i.e. the root cause? And obviously that's going to differ depending on the nature of the root cause. Michael will give an example in a second, but if we were doing something like a flood, your root cause would be rain. How much does it rain per levels per hour? How long does it rain for? What volume of water comes in, and so on and so forth. Now, as you move from the left to the right, and you move from causes to events all the way down to impacts on your critical operations and your tolerance types and tolerance levels, you progressively will reduce the number of assumptions you're having to make and really do more calculations, because the right hand side is more of a product of the left side. The left side is more for the drivers, where the assumptions are. The right side are more about calculations. So Michael, given that kind of brief explanation, given the example we've got here, do you want to just give us a little bit of an insight of some of those assumptions, an example?
Yeah, sure. So this is our DDoS attack. So here we've got an assumption on the left-hand side that we've got a botnet attack. That is the key driver, but the assumption is that, as always, it happens on a Friday afternoon. Might happen just the day before Easter or something like that. So these are the
Like
assumptions.
CrowdStrike, I should say. Like CrowdStrike.
Yes, yeah. In this particular scenario, we've got a sector-wide attack. It is not just the one bank. It is, there's 3 other major banks that have been affected. We're talking about exactly what the scenario is, the sustained attack, and how many terabits per second that we are including in this particular attack. And so these drivers are useful for the validation, which will be another step we'll talk about in a minute. But it makes it very clear during your exercising process exactly what you are dealing with, particularly as you get stakeholders to then assess whether these tolerance levels can be met. So these assumptions really start bringing this to life. And then on the right-hand side, we're leaning, as David mentioned, more towards the actual critical operations that are being affected. So here we've got assumptions about how quickly can you process a backlog? How many new inquiries will you get because of this DDoS attack? How many do you think that you'll get? How is that going to affect your service levels? How long are some of these processes going to be out? In this case, we've got a payment outage of 24 hours. So this is where you're then starting to really link that back to your tolerance levels as part of that scenario. So there are a range of different types of exercises that you can run as we now start thinking about how we can run these exercises. These are fairly common, typical breakdown for business continuity. You might have a slightly different way that you break these down, but ranging usually from a lower level of complexity and a lower level of resources being required, but a lower level of assurance, moving all the way up to then full exercises. A simulated exercise, you might activate a part of your scenario. So if you've got a third party that needs to help you with your business continuity response, you might go and make sure that they can actually deliver that response and get them to actually activate that response. Whereas a full exercise, which might not be practical for all of your critical operations, but it is actively simulating that scenario, trying to pool the resources that might be affected to try and then assess whether you can remain within those tolerance levels. So then if we move to actually exercising that scenario, I've broken this down into 3 sort of key phases. One is the preparation, getting prepared for that scenario in the first place. Then you've got your gut day, actually running your scenario, and then your post-scenario activity. So let's just look at each of those in turn. Now, when we start preparing for that scenario, you really need to define what are the objectives of the scenario. Why are we running the scenario? Now, for the CPS 230 perspective, time it should include some number of critical operations and specific tolerance levels that are going to be tested. Now, you might also have as part of that some specific level recovery point objectives, recovery time objectives, other metrics that you want to measure. You've got your tolerance levels for CPS 230. You might also want to be testing against some internal measures. So there may be things that you're, from an external lens, for your customer lens, that could be disruptive for a long period of time, but in terms of the financial impact to the organization, might be unacceptable to you. So you might also be testing those at the same time. I think it's also critical that you want to validate roles and responsibilities, who is making these responses as part of your, as part of the scenario that you're running, and also making sure that your communication plans are effective. So these are all potential objectives. You might not test all of them in a single scenario, but I think that they're critical. I also want to verify stakeholder buy-in. You don't want to set up a scenario that requires 12 people to be in the room to run and then 4 people turn up because you don't have the executive buy-in. So I think this, moving it back to that planning level for the overall program, you really need to get that buy-in at the executive level to ensure that you've got the right people involved at the right time. I'll just end on the service providers. So when you're preparing that scenario, also consider how third parties, material service providers, might play into that scenario. Because CPS 230, next slide, thanks David. CPS 230 requires you to make sure that you can meet your tolerance levels, even despite any disruptions of your material service providers. So there's 2 dimensions here. There's one where those third parties might support your business continuity response, or they support your critical operation that you need to have continuity for. So as you're developing out your scenarios, and I'm sure that this will mature over time, is consider how you're going to get them involved early as part of your journey, and which is ultimately about resilience for the whole financial system, not just necessarily just your critical operations. So when you're actually running the scenario, I think up front, you really want to articulate the objectives to those key stakeholders. Make sure they understand exactly what's expected of them. And also challenge, this goes both ways, challenging assumptions. It's about challenging their assumptions when you're delivering that scenario. Some will say, oh, we'll be able to do this. It'll be easy. We'll solve this problem. So it's about challenging them, but also making sure that they challenge back and make sure that the scenario is realistic and effective. You might need more than one person helping running the scenario, tracking issues. So a couple of the key issues you'd want to track is making sure that roles and responsibilities are clear. You might realize as you're running a scenario that you don't have the right people in the room, so make sure that that's really clear. And you also want to make sure that you're tracking the response and how effective it is. One thing I think we'll see, David, as things mature is running variations on these tolerance levels. You hinted at earlier, it's not about just tick the box exercise for APRA. That's not what they're looking for. They're looking to see that you have really stressed your scenarios. So if you get to the end of a scenario and it was easy, then maybe you need to look at those assumptions and go, well, would we still be operating within tolerance levels if we up this thing to somewhere else? Or would it matter if it happened in a different location or additional resources were affected?
And just maybe a quick comment there is also, the adjustment to scenarios based on incidents that have then just happened. As it's always the case, it brings back a memory of the amount of pandemic scenarios I did before 2020. And I think most of us who've ever run a pandemic scenario looked back and went, did we get anywhere near it? No. I've given up crystal ball gazing after that. But now when you run a pandemic scenario, you would use a lot of information that you experienced from that experience. So that is also, I think, very important as we keep updating.
Now, of course, running the scenario is not the end. It's important to make sure that then there's action that takes place after that scenario. So first of all, making sure that if you haven't defined your objectives up front, then clearly you can't go back and then ensure that you met them. So it's important to both set them up front and then go back and check, did we actually meet the objectives that we set? I think it's also critical to focus on improvement. I don't like the sort of language around, did we fail this test? It's, we ran an exercise and we had some learnings. I think that's a really good sort of approach to making sure this is why we're doing it. We're not looking for whether we're failing or not. It's, are we actually learning and improving? You want to distribute those results to those key stakeholders to make sure they're aware of what the outcomes are, any issues that they need to action. Also want to link it back to operational risk management. So these issues and actions, controls management, any issues that you identified should then feed back into your broader operational risk management and enterprise risk management.
Fantastic, Michael, and a lot of work there. So that brings us to the who. Who is responsible for scenarios, scenario analysis, and so on. We'll get into a little bit of detail in a minute, but I always like to say who's responsible for anything to do with risk management. That is you or everyone. And as much as everyone will not be running scenarios, you certainly need to get coverage, because a lot of those critical operations might well be reliant on a whole range of people, from very senior to more junior people. So we've got to make sure we encapsulate that whole range. Now, being very specific, first of all, at the board level, they're accountable for the oversight of risk management across the institution, and obviously that includes business continuity. They must approve the business continuity plan and make sure that the roles and responsibilities are very clear at the manager level. That's board accountability. And then we move into more the detail of who should be developing scenarios, who should be coming up with the schedule of exercising those scenarios, planning the specific exercises that we do, running the exercises, participation, which is where we need to get that wide coverage. Also, what do we do after the scenario in terms of things like follow-up and identifying issues and actions that need to be dealt, and also then prepare and develop reporting, which Michael is going to cover in a few minutes. Now, that leads us then to who is going to do this. And I don't think there's any one right answer here. So we've given some examples here where you'd expect absolutely them to be involved, but is it much wider than that? Well, I guess it comes back in anything to do with risk is thinking about the 3 lines model, line 1, line 2, and line 3, which we all do in financial services for obvious reasons. But what we've got to make sure is, as far as possible, we involve line one, because line one are the operators of your critical operations. They are the ones that are going to be dealing with things when that goes horribly wrong. And so, as always, line one is responsible for everything in operational risk management, including scenario analysis. That said, it's a specialist area, and you therefore need to consider the role of line two. And line two, as we know, is review and challenge, and also expert opinion. So this is where you might get line two advising on the scenarios. Their challenge might be, hey, are you giggling yet? No, therefore we need to push the scenario further. So line two has a very important independent role here, I believe, particularly in ensuring that no game playing is happening, and we are pushing the scenario to severe but plausible. Line three, internal audit, as we know, providing independent assurance over the other two lines. And that is obviously first and foremost making sure that line two is functioning as a reviewer, challenger, and expert opinion, and they are not doing all of the work on behalf of line one. So this really is like a lot of risk management, a really group collective exercise of making sure you involve enough of line one people, and it isn't just passed across to a kind of specialist line two group, because the front line one learnings will not then happen. And for those of you that have ever done purely line two based kind of scenarios, we often think we know what's going on but don't really know in detail. It's only when you get the absolute people at the coalface that run the operations you get the truth. So make sure you do that. So
I think
Michael,
maybe a point to add there, David. So critical operation owners, I think, is an interesting point, because CPS 230 doesn't require there to be CPS 230 owners specifically. But I'd question, if you don't have someone who's looking at that critical operation end to end, how you're going to demonstrate that you're making sure that you've got the right people who are responding to the results of scenarios to ensure that those critical operations are being delivered appropriately.
Yeah, look, it's a really good point. And I guess, prior to CPS 230, we heard APRA talk a lot about responsibilities and accountabilities, and the principle that if we've got an end-to-end process cutting across multiple business units with multiple BU heads, each BU head is responsible for that part of the process that's within their mandate. But one person needs to stand up and be accountable for the end-to-end process across all of those BUs. And that accountable person, in many ways, I think is the same as or very similar to the critical operation owner. And APRA does expect that. So it's a really, really good point. And that moves us to our final piece of the puzzle, reporting. Michael.
So CPS 230 requires reporting, particularly to the board. So this is related to what is required around BCP or scenarios and the board. So they need to review the results of testing and oversee, I don't like this wording, the execution of findings, but need to oversee any actions that come out of those tests. So the question is, well, what do you need to provide to who? What sort of reporting do they actually need? What gets included? So this is some high level views. Board, they want to know what was tested, what were the results, are there any actions that have been agreed, are there any follow-up questions that they're going to need to ask, those, whether it's critical operation owners or people looking after resilience. They need to know that high level, are we resilient? That's the sort of key question. Now below that, we then start looking at the executives who may be critical operation owners, or at least a component of a critical operation. So they need to know, are there any weaknesses that I need to care about and need to action? Are there any processes or resources that I own or my team own that support that critical operation that I need to be, have vulnerabilities I need to address? And then your business continuity manager, operational resilience manager, depending on how it's framed in your organisation, someone has to do some of this scheduling. I think the requirement for the guidance for APRA was every you should cover everything over a sort of 3-year period as a guide. That's not a specific requirement, but someone's going to have to think about that 3 years and think about how they're going to be able to do that. So they're also going to know, are we testing all the types of tolerances, and over a forecast, are we going to be testing them over the next period of time? So at Protect, we've come up with some dashboards that support some of these views. Now, we don't believe there is a one CPS 230 dashboard that solves every problem. This one is particularly related to our critical operations, and are they resilient. So broadly, are they resilient? How do they map against some of the individual resources and their vulnerabilities? As we're running our scenarios, what's the health of those scenarios? Do we think that we are vulnerable to that specific scenario? And being able to map that against all the individual critical operations. So not just at a scenario level, but for each individual critical operation, being able to see at a bird's eye view, have we tested this and is it resilient? Now, David, we talked earlier about, I guess, that CPS 230 resilience view and the severe but plausible, but critical operations also need to be thought about from a broader operational perspective. So there is the severe but plausible, but then there's the, as you mentioned, expected losses, that middle line between the expected and unexpected. So we also think about critical operations being a more typical operational risk profile, but looking at it from that critical operations lens. So this can start bringing into things that might not be severe but plausible and disrupt your tolerance levels, but compliance-related risks, for example, fraud that might not be a severe but plausible scenario that would disrupt your critical operations, but are still a really important for business continuity managers around scenario testing, controls assurance, for all of those different roles that we spoke about earlier. Before
Michael,
we close out, David, any more questions?
I do have one question, is if you wouldn't mind just addressing this slide again. We lost you for about 10 seconds there. Your mouth was moving vigorously, but there was no sound. So maybe if you could just address it, we do have a bit of time, because I know that will come back and haunt us.
Sure, just in case it wasn't there. So this is thinking about critical operations more broadly. So David mentioned earlier, we're really looking at severe but plausible, but that distribution that he showed has expected losses, and this is kind of more that expected losses, or moving a bit more into the unexpected losses. What are some of the risks that we face in our critical operations that might not be these severe but plausible issues, but are still things that we need to be managing? So just thinking about maybe non-disruptive risks like internal fraud or compliance issues that might not be disruptive, but are still things that we need to manage as part of that overall operational risk profile.
Fantastic. You were perfectly able to be heard that time round, so excellent. So we're coming to an end, just maybe a couple of conclusions. And while I may be saying my couple, Michael, maybe I'll come back to you and just your main takeaway and thing to think about. I think there's two for me. One is to make sure that your scenarios are severe enough all the way out to just before you start giggling. And mostly the human brain doesn't push scenarios big enough. And I think that was so borne out by the pandemic that none of us had pushed it out that far. I'll give you one example. One of the assumptions we've always made prior to 2020 around the scenarios for pandemics is how many staff would not come into the office, not be able to come in. The highest we got was 50% in any scenario I did with any client. What did we end up with? Yep, 100%. And we never got near it. So all I'm going to say to you is, number one takeaway, make sure you push your scenarios big enough. And my second conclusion is make sure you involve a wide group of people in these scenarios and don't just isolate it to a small working group of line 2 risk specialists, because otherwise, A, the truth won't be coming out, and B, the learnings won't be had from that scenario. Michael, final conclusion?
I think it's just mirroring exactly what you said, really. So making sure that you are adapting these scenarios more to that tolerance level perspective. If you've been taking a more traditional, what's the impact to the organisation, making sure that these scenarios are really focused on those tolerance levels, and just use your imagination. And I think also making sure you bring it back to that front line and making sure they're engaged with this process, because it won't work if it is just line 2, being the key stakeholders.
Fantastic, thank you. And as we always do, finish up with additional resources for you. So the key ones I want to highlight is, firstly, our project ERM system. As Michael said, we've built a dedicated resilience module as part of CPS 230. And that's been now with us for a couple of years, driven very heavily when the FCA and FSA in the UK came out with their requirements. The second one is our knowledge hub. And you can go there for more resources on CPS 230. And finally, on the right side, Protect Academy, our online training a course delivery function, and that has a specific course on operational resilience, so please have a look at that. The QR codes for each of those are there, so please do use them. So to finally conclude, a big thank you as always to Michael and all the insights you gave. You really carried this webinar, thank you. It was a bit more of a cruisy go for me, so thanks so much. Thank all of you for joining us for an hour, and I hope you got a lot out of it. And finally, if you could just take now a minute or so just to do the post-webinar questionnaire for feedback for us, that would be really well appreciated. Other than that, have a great rest of your day and stay resilient.
Thank you all. Hope you're all ready for the 1st of July.
Thank you.